Alright, what's going on everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Rakdos Vampire Challenger Deck into a Pioneer deck. We will not exceed the deck's retail price with our upgrades, which is around $30 USD, and hopefully we can get this thing up to speed in a much more powerful format. So Rakdos Vampires is very interesting because if you haven't been following professional Magic, it has become a top tier competitive deck and actually took first place at the most recent Pro Tour at the time of this recording. Rakdos Vampires was non-existent in the metagame, and Seth Manfield came out of nowhere and won a Pro Tour with it. His deck was built around Floran, Imperious Bloodlord, and Vein Ripper. Soren's -3 lets you put a vampire onto the battlefield, meaning you can get a Vein Ripper out on turn 3, which can completely take over the game when it's played early. The problem with both of these cards though is they're very expensive, so we can't really play them on a budget. And not only this, but the rest of the deck was filled with a lot of traditional Rakdos mid-range cards like Thoughtseize, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Sheoldred, all of which are just way too expensive for us. We're going to be sticking to the more traditional Rakdos Vampires list as you see in the Challenger deck, but the cool thing is, whereas this was previously just a strictly casual deck, now, we do have a deck we can aspire to, which is cool. So this deck has a lot of solid vampires, Blood Tithe Harvester, Vampire Socialite, Floran, all are great cards, and we'll definitely be adding more of them, but this deck came with a lot of cards like Village Rites, Mukatai Soul Ripper, Oni Cult Anvil, all of which need to go at this point. The idea behind the Challenger deck is the vampires can make blood tokens, and those would fuel the Rakdos sacrifice package, and it was okay. It kind of worked for a little while in standard. Oni Cult Anvil and Blood Tithe Harvester, those two cards were like top tier competitive decks right around the time that Neon Dynasty was released, but they haven't really held up in Pioneer, so a lot of this Rakdos sack stuff just needs to get out of the deck. We'll be a lot better off without them. So let's start by taking out 2 Oni Cult Anvils for 2 more Vampire Socialite. As I just got done saying, the sacrifice package is just not great, and the Socialite is just a very solid aggro threat for the deck. A 2-mana 2/2 that can put counters on everything when it enters and then adds counters to everything when we play it afterward is just very solid for some beefy board presence. Next we'll take out 3 Immersturm Predators for 3 Nighthawk Scavengers. The Predators are another remnant of that sacrifice strategy because, it's a vampire but it could sacrifice stuff, but it's pretty weak. And the Nighthawk Scavengers, they're pretty solid. They have power equal to the number of card types in your opponent's graveyard +1. So absolute worst case scenario, they don't have a graveyard and it's a 3-mana 1/3 flying Death Touch lifelink, which is pretty medium, but usually, it's a 3-mana 4/3. Even a 3-mana 3/3 is pretty good. This thing definitely doesn't get as powerful as it does in like rogue decks that can mill the opponent, but it's still solid, especially since we are still kind of a Rakdos mid-range deck and we kill stuff a lot, so we can get a couple card types in the graveyard pretty easily. And another very important aspect of this, the flying helps activate stuff like Vampire Socialite and Floran. Just make sure we can hit the opponent consistently. Next, we'll take out the final Predator for a Floran Voldaren Scion. Floran is a great way to generate card advantage. I often find that I don't attack with him at all. He just sits on defense and just gets me free stuff off the top of my library. And he makes the deck very versatile, allowing us to be both aggressive but also mid-rangey if we just care about card advantage and like a control matchup, for example. Next, we'll take out 2 Dominating Vampires for 2 Preacher of the Schism. So the purpose of the Dominating Vampires was to gain control of an opponent's creature and then sacrifice it, which was okay in the original deck, but is getting much weaker as we take out the sacrifice stuff. I mean, it's like a really powerful sort of tempo play, being able to pull a blocker out and then hit for a lot of damage. That's a lot of aggression, but then it just doesn't really do anything after that. The Preacher, on the other hand, this is being played in so many like Rakdos mid-range and mono black control decks. What makes them so nice is when it attacks, if we're ahead on life, we lose 1 life and draw, and if we're behind, then we get a 1/1 lifelinker. So it's basically like always good in every matchup no matter what. It's like It's not the most aggressive or the most card advantage-y vampire ever, but it basically always does something good no matter what. So like against an aggro deck, it's a 2/4, which is just a brick wall that makes 1/1 lifelinkers, and in a mid-range matchup, it draws us cards and makes 1/1s, right? So it's like, it's just always good, which is why this card is being played in so many decks, and conveniently for us, it's a vampire, and they're pretty cheap. Hopefully it stays that way, because like I said, it's being played everywhere, so it could go up in time, but right now, it's affordable, and that's nice. After that, we'll take out 2 Sockins and Smelters for 2 Dusk Legion Zealots. This is pretty self-explanatory. The Smelters were there for the sacrifice strategy that we're removing, and the Zealots are basically just a redraw. This is played in the Pro Tour winning deck, just because it's another card advantage piece. You play it, it replaces itself. It can be cast off Floran to get extra cards. It's an extra chump blocker if we need it. It can get counters from Socialite and become more threatening. It looks unexciting, but it slots in really nicely, which is perfectly fine. Next, we have a lot of non-creature spells that were part of that sacrifice package that need to be removed. I mean, take Voltage Surge for example. It was a pretty okay removal piece in Standard, but we're playing a Rakdos deck in Pioneer. We have better options than this. So let's start by taking out those 4 Voltage Surges for 4 Fatal Pushes, a premier removal spell in the format that is pretty good in our deck because we have a lot of blood tokens that we can sacrifice to help trigger Revolt. So like for the first couple turns, it usually blows up aggro creatures, like against red aggro. Perfectly happy to just throw this at any 1 or 2 drop. But in the late game, we can get bigger stuff with blood tokens. And I will say that if you want to reduce the budget even further, you could probably replace these with Blood Chief's Thirst instead. These are much cheaper in terms of the price to buy them, but they're clunkier at sorcery speed, and you know, it's okay, but fortunately we have enough room in the budget for Fatal Push, so we'll go with that for my official recommendation. We'll also take out a Village Rites for a Heartless Act. Village Rites is okay, but it doesn't have the impact without things like Oniko Anvil, so removing it just for a solid removal spell is preferred. Feel free to add basically any removal spell here, though I do want to caution you to keep a low mana curve. Remember that we do a lot of casting from Floran, and he's very mana hungry, so I don't like playing clunky, high mana value removal cards. I mean, there are some very solid and playable removal spells that cost like 3 or 4, but in this deck, because we want to be super mana efficient to cast stuff with Floran, I prefer to stick to 1 to 2 mana removal spells. And right after saying that, we're going to add a 4-drop. We're going to take out 2 Mukotai Soul Rippers for 2 Soran the Mirthless. So even though we're adding a 4 mana spell, just keep in mind that we took out 4 Emberstorm Predators, which cost 4, and we replaced them with 3 drops. So our curve is leaner overall. It's just that this screen in particular doesn't look as good, but the vehicle serves basically no purpose and was pretty bad even when this deck was first released. And Soran is perfect for the mid-range aspect of this deck. He gets cards off the top. We're a low curve deck, so it shouldn't be too painful. Most of our deck costs 3 or less. He makes flying lifelinkers, which is great for triggering Floran, and his final ability is entirely irrelevant, but Soran is great for just being kind of a mid-range card advantage engine, and he makes vampires, which is perfect. So we need to talk about the mana base. The good lands for this deck are driving me crazy because they are just barely out of our budget. I mean, literally, the fast lands and pathways are very affordable, but you know, when we're adding 4 of each, it just completely breaks our $30 budget. We're trying to stick to $30 USD or less. So while I can't afford to add them in our budget build, I highly encourage you to pick these up as soon as you can, because they're only going to get more expensive with time if they aren't reprinted. These shock lands are pricey, I will say, but a lot of the other dual lands for this deck are very cheap. They're the type of lands that, you know, you can pick up 1 or 2 here or there. You can go to a Friday Night Magic and get a couple of them, and it doesn't feel terrible, and you know, you could build it over time, which is definitely recommended. I also do want to note that there are some budget tribal lands that can be added to this deck. I was really on the fence with these because they're really good and they're super cheap, but we have a lot of non-creature removal, and I found so many times that I'd have a bunch of tribal lands and I just wouldn't be able to cast my removal. So you could probably add a couple of these. You could even just put a playset in of one or the other if you wanted to just to start, but I just found it to be infuriating. I constantly just couldn't cast removal because of these, so consider that optional and potentially dangerous. What I do want to do, however, is take out 2 mountains for 2 swamps. Most of our deck is either black or Rakdos, and most of the red cards are vampires that can be cast with Voldaren Estate, so increasing our black sources just seems advisable. I do have a few budget upgrades for the sideboard, but I don't like to go too crazy here because you should really be tailoring your sideboard to your local metagame. But some budget upgrades would include 2 Callous Blood Mage for 2 Go Blanks. The Blood Mage just doesn't really do anything, and Go Blank is great against like combo and graveyard decks. We can also take out Falkenrath Forebears for 2 Damping Spheres, which is great against things like Lotus Field decks and similar stuff to that. We're also going to take out 1 Abrade for 1 Ashiok Dreamrender, which can stop people from searching their libraries and give us another way to exile graveyards. And that's actually it. That's it for our upgrades. I'm pretty happy with the main board of the stack. The sideboard is something you should definitely adapt to your local meta. And going forward with this deck, even though we do have a tier 1 deck to look to for future upgrades, the first thing I would do is upgrade the mana base, get the Bloodfell Caves out, add more duels. They're very affordable, but we are capping out our budget, so I can't be adding them for this guide specifically. But either way, this build is much more consistent with its game plan. It's really good at aggressively playing vampires early and then kind of morphing into a mid-range deck in the late game. You should be able to pressure people, you should be able to outdraw people. That's sort of what this deck is doing, and hopefully that's useful. So check the description below. I will leave a link to the final deck list as well as some meta Rakdos Vampire decks. I'll even specifically link to Seth Manfield's Pro Tour deck if you want to check that out. But in the meantime, I hope this was useful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.